It began with desperation, the kind that tests the limits of pride and love. She was a woman drowning in debt, standing in the ruins of everything she'd built. He was a man of power, a millionaire who had everything, except a heart that could still feel. When their worlds collided, it wasn't romance, it was a deal cold, calculated, unthinkable. "Give me a child," he said, "and I'll erase your debt." But what neither of them knew was that sometimes the most impossible choices become the beginning of redemption. This is not just a story about money or power. It's about two broken souls learning what it means to heal, about how love can rise from the ashes of control, and how forgiveness can turn strangers into something more. Through heartbreak, betrayal, and second chances, they will discover that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in courage, compassion, and the grace to begin again. So, sit back and listen closely, because this isn't just a story about falling in love, it's about learning how to be human again. It began before dawn. The kind of Seattle rain that didn't just fall, it descended, steady and relentless, like the sky had forgotten how to stop crying. Claire hadn't slept much. She'd been up late balancing the cafe books again, scribbling numbers that no longer made sense. But by the time she heard the sound, the low, humming growl of water against glass, it was already too late. She rushed downstairs barefoot. The air was heavy, smelling of wet wood and earth. The floor was slick. The front window trembled under the pressure of rising water. And when it finally gave way, the sound was deafening, a burst of chaos as icy floodwater swallowed the room she had built with her own hands. Morning tide, her little cafe, once warm and golden in the mornings, was now just a blur of floating chairs and shattered mugs. The smell of espresso beans and cinnamon rolls, usually comforting, was drowned out by mud and salt and fear. Her hands shook as she grabbed what she could: a few photographs, a worn recipe card, her grandmother's old coffee journal wrapped in a damp towel. That journal was her inheritance, her compass. Inside were notes written in faded blue ink measurements, memories, and one line Claire had always loved: "A good cup of coffee can't fix a life, but it can remind you life is still worth fixing." She stood in knee-deep water, shivering, watching photo frames float past her like ghosts. Each one carried a piece of her the grand opening day, her staff laughing in aprons, her grandmother smiling from an old Polaroid taped near the counter. Now, they drifted away, faces dissolving in the muddy current. Outside, the rain turned merciless. Streets became rivers. A newspaper stand collapsed under the weight of the storm. A car alarm wailed somewhere far off, then stopped. The city, always so busy, so alive, felt muted, like someone had turned down the sound of the world. By sunrise, the water began to pull back, leaving behind silence and ruin. Claire stepped out into what used to be her sidewalk. Her shoes sank into mud. The sign that once read "Morning Tide Cafe" hung at an angle. One chain snapped, dripping. She found a chair, turned upside down in the street. It still had a tag from when she bought it 7 years ago, the day she first opened her doors. Back then, she believed that if you worked hard enough, the world would meet you halfway. But standing there, soaked and shaking, she realized the world didn't always keep its promises. Hours later, the rain eased into drizzle. Emergency crews passed by, shouting instructions. Neighbors checked on one another. Someone handed her a blanket. Someone else offered coffee from a thermos. But Claire just nodded, numb. She walked back inside, the bell above her ruined door giving one last, pitiful ring. Her cafe smelled like lost wet drywall, broken dreams, burnt wires. She set the journal on a dry patch of counter, opened it gently, and tried to breathe. Her hands were scratched. Her hair clung to her face. She told herself it was just a building, that people lost worse things. But when she saw the foreclosure notice, now water-stained but still taped to the back office door, her throat closed. That piece of paper had arrived the week before, the cruel reminder of debts she couldn't pay, of deadlines she couldn't outrun. She had promised herself she'd find a way, that the cafe would survive. But now, staring at the soggy ink bleeding down the page, She whispered to no one. Sometimes the water doesn't just take things, it takes the future you thought you had. And in that moment, surrounded by the ruins of her dream, she wasn't the owner of Morningtide Cafe anymore. She was just a woman in her 30s, standing in a cold puddle, holding the last piece of her grandmother's legacy and wondering if she had the strength to start over. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. A single beam of morning light broke through the clouds and fell across the shattered counter. It touched the old journal, making the wet pages glisten, like even the storm wanted to apologize. Claire didn't know it yet, but this morning, the one that took everything would also become the morning that changed the course of her life. Because sometimes, losing everything isn't the end. Sometimes, it's the first quiet step towards something new. The morning after the flood smelled like mildew and heartbreak. Claire woke to silence the kind that follows a storm, when even the birds seemed too stunned to sing. The cafe was gone. The insurance company, polite but distant, called it an act of God, an elegant phrase for something that left her with nothing. She sat by the window of her small apartment, wrapped in her grandmother's old quilt, scrolling through her bank app, the numbers glowing back like a cruel countdown. Insurance denied, loans overdue, employees waiting for paychecks that would never come. Her phone buzzed again, another message from the bank. Final notice. That phrase alone could make a person forget how to breathe. Down on the street, people were sweeping water from storefronts, trying to salvage what they could. Seattle had already moved on, but Claire couldn't. Her world had stopped in that moment when the cafe drowned, and with it, her sense of who she was. Evelyn came over that afternoon, her raincoat dripping, her expression equal parts concern and frustration. Evelyn was more than a friend. She had been Claire's first employee, her steady right hand, her voice of reason when the world went sideways. "Claire," she said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder, "you can't carry this alone. Ask for help. Talk to the bank. There must be someone who can." But Claire shook her head before the sentence finished. Her pride was a stubborn, carved from the same stone as her grandmother's. "I'll figure it out," she said. "I always do." Evelyn sighed. "No one's expecting you to be a hero." Claire smiled faintly, eyes tired. "Then maybe they don't know me." The truth was, she wasn't just clinging to pride. She was clinging to dignity, the one thing the flood hadn't washed away. Days turned into a week. She made phone calls, filled out forms, pleaded with loan officers who sounded more like machines than people. Every conversation ended the same way. "We're sorry, Ms. Whitmore. Our hands are tied." Her hands, too, were tied, bound by debt, by guilt, by the crushing responsibility of every paycheck she still owed. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her staff standing in the muddy ruins, waiting for answers she didn't have. That's when she remembered Cross Dynamics. The name felt almost ironic now, the largest corporate client her cafe had ever served. Every week, they'd ordered custom blends for their executive floors. Their logo had been the one steady contract keeping Morningtide afloat. So, when an email came from the company's HR office, inviting her to meet the CEO in person, she hesitated, but agreed. It wasn't hope she felt, it was survival instinct. The next morning, Claire found herself standing in the marble lobby of Cross Dynamics Tower, a glass monument that seemed to pierce the gray Seattle sky. She felt small there, her thrift store coat still faintly smelling of smoke and rain, her shoes slightly scuffed. The elevator doors opened on the top floor, and there he was, Nathaniel Cross, the man whose company had filled her shelves for years, yet she'd never met him before. He stood by the window, tall, composed, framed by the soft light of a city still drying from the storm. His suit was immaculate, his posture precise. Every movement seemed measured, deliberate. When he turned, his eyes met hers, cool, analytical, almost unreadable. It was the look of a man who weighed everything people included by what they could offer, what they could fix, what they could risk. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice calm, unhurried. "I heard about the cafe. I'm sorry for your loss." The words sounded sincere, but his tone carried no warmth. He gestured for her to sit. They spoke of logistics first contracts, invoices, unpaid deliveries. Claire tried to keep her voice steady, but each word felt like a confession of failure. When the meeting ended, she gathered her things, ready to leave quietly. But Nathaniel paused. "Tell me," he said. "What are you planning to do next?" The question pierced her. What was she planning? I don't know, she admitted softly. Start over. Maybe. Somehow. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. I could use a temporary secretary, someone organized, someone who understands discretion. Claire blinked. You're offering me a job. He nodded once, as if it were nothing more than a business decision. It's temporary, he added. A few months, maybe longer. Consider it. A bridge. A bridge. The word lingered in her chest. She didn't trust it didn't trust him. Men like Nathaniel Cross didn't build bridges out of kindness. Still. When he handed her his card, she took it. The weight of it felt heavier than paper, as though it carried a future she hadn't yet agreed to. That night, Claire sat alone at her kitchen table, the city lights flickering through her rain-streaked window. She turned the card over and over in her hands. Cross Dynamics. Nathaniel Cross. The name that might, just might, keep her from losing everything. But beneath that thought was another, quieter one, a question that wouldn't go away. Why her? As she placed the card beside her grandmother's journal, a shiver ran through her, not from cold, but from something else. The feeling that her life, which had already been upended once by the flood, was about to be rewritten again. Outside, the rain began to fall softly against the glass. Not in anger this time, but like a whisper, a reminder. The storm was over, but the reckoning had just begun. It had been 3 days since that meeting in the glass tower. 3 long days of silence, of replaying every word Nathaniel Cross had said and everyone he hadn't. Claire told herself she wouldn't call him back. She didn't belong in his world of glass walls and polished steel. But when her landlord slipped a letter under her door that morning, a final eviction notice, her resolve cracked like old porcelain. By afternoon, she stood once again in the lobby of Cross Dynamics, her reflection faint in the marble floor. The receptionist recognized her, smiled politely, and made a quick call. "Mr. Cross will see you now." The elevator hummed as it rose. Each floor that passed felt like another layer of her old life peeling away. When the doors opened, Nathaniel was waiting. He stood by the window again. The Seattle skyline spread behind him like a painting in grayscale. He didn't turn immediately, just said, in that calm, steady tone, "I was wondering when you'd come." Claire's voice was soft. "I almost didn't." "But you did," he replied, finally turning to face her. And in that moment, she saw something different in his eyes, not kindness exactly, but something quieter, heavier, the look of a man rehearsing a difficult truth. He gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit." The conversation began the way business meetings do, polite, structured, sterile. He asked about her financial situation. She answered carefully, feeling her dignity shrink with every admission. Past due notices, unpaid staff. The words came out like weights. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his hands folded neatly on the desk. When she finished, there was a pause, the kind that feels like the air itself has stopped breathing. Then he said it, the sentence that would change everything. "I can erase your debt. Claire. All of it." She blinked, stunned. Her heartbeat filled the silence. There had to be a catch. There was always a catch. Why, she whispered. "Why would you do that?" Nathaniel's eyes didn't waver. "Because I need something in return." He stood, walked toward the window, his reflection merging with the gray light outside. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that didn't belong in a boardroom. "My late wife. She wanted children more than anything." He paused, then continued each word deliberate. "An accident. Years ago. Medical complications. I survived, but I was left infertile, Since then, I've tried every path available: surrogacy, adoption, legal arrangements. None succeeded. Claire sat frozen, unsure what to say. The story was intimate, too personal, and yet his tone remained measured, almost clinical. "I want an heir," he said finally. "Someone to continue what I've built, to carry the cross name, and I can't have one." Her throat tightened. "And you think Yes." He turned then, meeting her gaze directly. "Give me a child, Claire, and I'll erase your debt." The words hit like thunder, quiet, devastating, impossible to process all at once. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard him, that there was some other meaning hidden beneath his cold precision. But no. His expression was calm, his eyes steady. "You're serious," she said. He nodded once, completely. She stood, disbelief flashing into anger. "Do you hear yourself? You're asking me to make a choice," he interrupted. "A difficult one, yes, but one that benefits you as much as it does me." Claire took a step back, her chest tight. "This isn't business. This is—" Her voice broke. "This is wrong." Nathaniel's tone softened slightly. "I'm offering security, a future, freedom from the debt that's crushing you." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You're offering a transaction, Mr. Cross, not a future?" For the first time, his composure cracked just slightly. He looked away, as though even he couldn't stand the sound of what he'd said aloud. "I don't expect you to answer now," he murmured. "Think about it. You have my number." And with that, the meeting was over. No handshake, no goodbye. Just the quiet hum of the elevator as it carried her back down to the street to a world that suddenly felt colder than before. That night, the rain returned, soft, steady, like it had been listening all along. Claire sat by her window again, staring at the city lights that shimmered across puddles. Her phone rested on the table, Nathaniel's card beside it. She didn't touch either. Her thoughts tangled like roots pride against desperation, morality against survival. What kind of woman would even consider such an offer? And yet, what kind of woman could afford not to? She opened her grandmother's coffee journal, tracing the familiar ink stains. So many recipes, each one a little piece of comfort, a small act of love. Her grandmother had always believed that no choice made from love could ever truly be shameful. But this wasn't love. It was survival. And survival, she realized, had its own kind of sin. The city outside flickered under the rain, and Claire whispered to the quiet room, "Was it still sin if it saved the lives built under your care?" No one answered, only the sound of rain against glass. She sat there until dawn, her coffee cold, her heart torn between what she knew was right and what she feared she might have to do. When the first light crept over the horizon, she hadn't signed anything, not yet. But somewhere deep inside, the decision had already begun to form, like the slow rise of water before another storm. The morning came without color. A dull gray light spilled through Claire's blinds, painting everything in shades of hesitation. She hadn't slept, not since that night in her kitchen when Nathaniel Cross's words had echoed in her mind, "Give me a child, and I'll erase your debt." They had burrowed deep, lingering like smoke you can't quite wash out. By the third dawn, her resistance had turned to exhaustion. Not surrender, exactly, just weariness. The kind that comes when every moral battle has already been fought in the dark. She told herself she was doing this for her staff, for Evelyn, for the barista who'd lost her apartment, for the delivery man whose kids still needed school shoes. It was easier to carry the weight when she convinced herself it wasn't just her burden. And so, on a quiet Thursday morning, she walked into the downtown office of Cross Dynamics Legal Affairs, her grandmother's coffee journal tucked in her bag like a talisman. The boardroom was nothing like the world she came from. It was cold, clinical walls of frosted glass, a long table of dark oak, pens lined with mathematical precision. The air smelled faintly of leather and money. 2 lawyers sat waiting, each with a folder in front of them. A third poured coffee without being asked black. Bitter, impersonal. Nathaniel was already there, impeccable as always, his tie perfectly straight, his cufflinks catching the morning light. He nodded as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Whitmore," he said softly, "thank you for coming." She wanted to laugh, as if she had a choice. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Let's begin." The contract was thick pages upon pages of legal language that blurred together, sterile and absolute. She skimmed the words, but they might as well have been written in another language. Confidentiality clause, custody rights, medical obligations. Her fingers trembled as she turned each page. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. Nathaniel watched her in silence. His face gave nothing away. Not impatience, not guilt, just control. He had always been a man who believed in structure, in rules that kept chaos at bay. But as he watched Claire struggle to steady her hands, something in him flickered a tiny, unwanted pang of conscience. He told himself this wasn't cruelty. This was practicality. Two adults entering a transaction, nothing more. Still, the echo of his late wife's voice haunted him. Not everything you build with control will last. He pushed the memory away, straightened his posture, and said quietly, "This isn't about love, Claire. It's about clarity, about making sure both of us understand the terms." Claire looked up from the papers then, her eyes tired but defiant. "I understand the terms," she said. "What I don't understand is the man who wrote them." The room went still. One of the lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. She signed the first page, then another. Her signature looked foreign, a fragile mark beneath lines of unfeeling ink. By the time she reached the last page, her hand was trembling. She hesitated, pen hovering above the final line. "Are you sure?" one of the lawyers asked gently. Claire didn't answer right away. She glanced out the window, gray clouds rolling over the city, raindrops streaking the glass. Seattle again, reminding her that storms don't ask for permission, they just come. And when they do, you either drown or you swim. Her hand steadied. She signed. Nathaniel exhaled quietly, though he hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. He reached for the papers, sliding them neatly into a folder. For a long moment, neither spoke. He looked at her, not the way a man looks at a woman, but the way someone examines the aftermath of a decision that can't be undone. Her face was pale, but her eyes still held something fierce, a quiet fire that no contract could extinguish. He almost admired her for it, but admiration was dangerous. He reminded himself that this wasn't about emotion. It was about structure, control, love, he told himself, was chaos, and chaos was what had destroyed him once before. He stood, buttoning his jacket. The movement was sharp, final. "Then let's begin," he said softly. Claire didn't answer. She simply gathered her things, her fingers brushing the coffee journal inside her bag, as if to remind herself she was still human, still capable of warmth in a room built for cold transactions. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves swirled down the street, caught between gusts and gutters. She walked slowly, her steps heavy but deliberate. The city carried on as if nothing monumental had happened, as if a woman hadn't just traded her future for survival. But Claire knew. Every step she took felt like crossing an invisible threshold from the life she'd known into something she couldn't yet name. At a street corner, she paused, looking up at the clouds. Somewhere above them, she thought. The sun was still there, just waiting to break through. Maybe that was enough for now. Maybe the ink on the contract had barely dried when Claire began to feel its weight not as paper, but as presence. Every morning after that day, she woke with the same dull ache in her chest. It wasn't regret exactly. Regret was loud. This was quiet, like an echo that never fully faded. Nathaniel Cross had kept his word. Her debts were cleared, her bank account restored, her staff paid in full. The cafe's remains had been taken care of, the notices gone, but with every burden lifted, another seemed to settle on her shoulders. A different kind of debt, one that no lawyer could erase. She was now his secretary. On paper, it was temporary. In truth, it felt like servitude dressed in elegance. Her first week at Cross Dynamics was a study in contrast. Nathaniel's office ran like clockwork, precise, ordered, silent. Every file, every email, every word measured down to the second. He spoke little, but when he did, his tone carried authority sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Claire tried to blend into that rhythm, but it wasn't in her nature. She was warmth in a world of glass and steel, smiling when others avoided eye contact, thanking the janitor who changed the trash, remembering birthdays no one else did. Her kindness was soft but persistent, the kind that made people pause, unsure if they were allowed to return it. Nathaniel noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything. He watched her the way a scientist might watch a candle, fascinated by the flicker, wary of the flame. One evening, after everyone else had gone, Claire stayed late to finish filing reports. The office lights dimmed automatically at 8, leaving her in a pool of golden light against a backdrop of glass. Outside, the city glowed with the restless shimmer of Seattle's nightlife. She looked out, breathing in the faint scent of rain, and in the reflection, she saw him standing a few steps behind her. "I didn't hear you come in," she said softly. Nathaniel's voice was calm. "You work late. I'm used to it," she replied. "When you own a cafe, you learn that mornings start early and nights end late." He nodded, stepping closer, but not too close. "You don't have to overextend yourself here." She smiled faintly. "Then, what would I do with all this time?" There was a pause. Something unspoken stretched between them, not affection, not yet, but the faint recognition of another lonely soul. Then he turned away. "Good night, Ms. Whitmore." And just like that, the moment dissolved. By the second week, she noticed small things. Her desk was always stocked with her favorite decaf blend. She hadn't told anyone she didn't drink caffeine after noon. A vase of fresh daisies appeared one Monday morning. No note attached. She wanted to believe it was coincidence, but when she mentioned it to Evelyn during their weekly coffee meetup, Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Claire," she said, stirring her latte slowly, "you realize he's watching you, right?" Claire tried to laugh. "He's my boss. Of course he's watching my work." Evelyn's tone softened, but her eyes were sharp. "No, not your work. You." Claire hesitated. "He's complicated." "He's not complicated," Evelyn countered. "He's controlled. That's different. And people like him, they don't save others. Claire, they trap them." The words hit hard. "He's not your savior," Evelyn added quietly. "He's a man trapped in his own cage. Don't mistake the bars for protection." Claire looked down at her cup, watching the foam swirl. She wanted to protest, but she couldn't, because deep down, she already felt at the invisible walls, the constant awareness of being seen. The days blurred into each other after that. Mornings began with silence. Evenings ended with exhaustion. Nathaniel's efficiency was both mesmerizing and unsettling. He never raised his voice, never faltered, never seemed to feel. His entire existence was precision, even his kindness, when it appeared, felt calculated. And yet, she caught glimpses fleeting, fragile moments that made her question the man behind the mask. The way his hand lingered just a second too long on the edge of a photo on his desk, a picture of his late wife, framed in silver. The way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, eyes distant, as if haunted by something he refused to name. There was a man buried beneath the CEO, she thought. A man who'd forgotten how to be human. But she also knew it wasn't her place to rescue him. One night, after finishing a late meeting, Claire packed her things and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, she glanced up and saw a small, almost hidden security camera in the corner. Its red light blinked once. She hesitated. Had it always been there by the time she reached the ground floor? A chill had crept up her spine. She shook it off, telling herself she was overthinking. But as she walked out into the rain, that feeling lingered, that sense of being watched even when she was alone, at home. She placed her grandmother's coffee journal on the counter, flipping to the last page. A line caught her eye, one she hadn't noticed before, scrawled in faded ink, almost like a whisper across time. Kindness can warm even the coldest heart. But remember, fire burns too. She closed the book, pressing her palm against the cover. In the reflection of her kitchen window, the rain shimmered like tears down glass. She thought of Nathaniel, of his distance, his control, and that brief, unguarded look he'd given her by the window. And for the first time, Claire wondered if she was the one being drawn into a storm, this time not by nature, but by a man whose calm hid the quiet chaos within him. It started with the smallest of things. A cup of decaf coffee left on her desk the way she liked it. No sugar. A hint of cream, still steaming. No note, no words, just there. At first, Claire thought it was a coincidence, but when it appeared again the next morning, same cup, same time she knew it wasn't. And somehow, that small act felt louder than any apology could have been. The truth was, after the unease of those early weeks, the air around Nathaniel Cross had begun to shift. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like the first warmth of sunlight after too many gray mornings. One afternoon, she found him standing by the office coffee machine, of all places. A man like him who had assistants for his assistants grinding beans by hand. The smell filled the room, rich, earthy, familiar. She hesitated by the doorway. He didn't turn, but he spoke as if he knew she was there. I remembered what you said once, about your grandmother's blend. Claire blinked. You remember that Nathaniel gave a small nod. She wrote it in her journal, didn't she? The ratio of roast to water, the one you said made it taste like home. She smiled, surprised. Yes, but I didn't think you were listening. He glanced up then, a faint curve touching his lips. I listen more than people think. The moment passed as quickly as it came, but something inside her softened not in surrender, but in recognition. That week, laughter found its way into the sterile halls of Cross Dynamics. Not often, not loud, but real. It began when the printer jammed during a client presentation. Claire, half stressed and half laughing, muttered something under her breath about technology having an attitude. To her shock, Nathaniel actually smiled. Then to everyone's greater shock, he laughed. Not a polite corporate chuckle, but an honest, unguarded laugh that made people turn their heads. It startled her how human it sounded. After the meeting, as they walked out together, Claire looked at him and said, "Careful, Mr. Cross. If you keep that up, people might start thinking you're human." He raised an eyebrow, amused. Maybe that wouldn't be so bad. And for the first time since she'd met him, his eyes held warmth. That night, long after everyone else had gone home, Nathaniel lingered in his office. The city lights cast shifting reflections on the glass, fragments of gold and blue. He sat in silence, hands clasped, staring at the faint imprint her coffee cup had left on his desk. Something about it, the ring of warmth on cold wood, stirred an ache he hadn't felt in years. Memories he'd buried began to surface. He was 8 again, sitting in the corner of a cavernous dining room, silverware clinking against porcelain. His father, a man of discipline and steel, reading the newspaper in silence. His mother, her hands folded neatly, eyes empty. No one spoke, not once. Even as a child, Nathaniel had understood that silence wasn't peace, it was control. He'd learned early that feelings were weaknesses, that affection could be used as leverage. So he built walls strong, invisible, unyielding until nothing could reach him. Until now. Because somewhere between Claire's laughter and her decaf coffee, a crack had appeared. The next morning, he arrived early. Claire was already there, her hair tied loosely, sleeves rolled up, sunlight touching her face as she organized the morning reports. "Good morning," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. "You're early, so are you." She smiled. Habit. He set down 2 cups on her desk, one for her, one for him. Her eyebrows lifted. "You made these personally," he said, his tone so serious that she almost believed him until she caught the faintest flicker of humor in his eyes. They shared a small laugh, simple, genuine, and for a moment, it didn't feel like a contract. It felt like something closer to companionship, fragile, maybe, but real. Evelyn noticed the change before Claire did. During their weekly meetup, she studied Claire's face over coffee. "You look different," Evelyn said, lighter somehow. Claire shrugged, stirring her drink. "Maybe I'm just adjusting. Or maybe he's changing," Evelyn replied. Claire looked away. "He's still Nathaniel Cross," Evelyn nodded. "Maybe, but so are you still Claire Whitmore. Don't lose that part." Claire smiled softly. "I won't." But as she walked home later that evening, she couldn't shake the thought. What if change wasn't about losing yourself, but finding a part of you you'd forgotten how to trust? The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that almost felt normal. They worked in quiet synchronicity, her warmth balancing his precision, his order grounding her chaos. Sometimes he'd ask about her grandmother's recipes. Sometimes she'd tease him about his obsession with structure. And slowly, imperceptibly, the space between them began to shift from transactional to personal, from silence to something that resembled peace. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the first spark of something that didn't fit neatly into any clause of their contract. That Friday, as she packed up to leave, Nathaniel stopped by her desk. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Finally, he said, "Claire, you remind me that life doesn't have to be efficient to be worthwhile." She looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "Then maybe," she said softly, "you're finally learning what the rest of us already know, that not all value can be measured." He nodded once, quietly, and when she turned to go, he whispered not to her, but to himself. Maybe not all contracts are written on paper. For a while, it almost felt like peace, not the loud kind that comes with laughter or music, but a quiet, gentle rhythm, a fragile calm built between two people learning to breathe in the same space. Claire had begun to see Nathaniel not just as the man who held her contract, but as someone human, flawed, guarded, trying, in his own silent way, to mend something he didn't yet know was broken. And Nathaniel, though he would never say it aloud, had started to rely on her presence. Her voice softened the edges of his days. Her laughter reminded him that not every sound in this world had to be measured or managed, but peace built on secrets never lasts. It began on an ordinary evening. Claire had just returned home from work, her hands full of grocery bags, her mind pleasantly tired. She hummed softly to herself as she unpacked the sound of glass jars, the faint scent of coffee grounds, the hum of her refrigerator. Then a flicker, a faint red light in the corner of her living room. At first, she thought it was her router, but when she stepped closer, her stomach turned cold. It wasn't a router. It was a small, barely visible camera, tucked neatly behind a stack of books. Her hands froze midair. Her breath caught. No, it couldn't be. She checked the kitchen, another one, above the cabinets, and one in the hallway, hidden in the smoke detector. By the time she found the fourth, her vision had blurred with disbelief. It felt like the air itself had turned against her, heavy, suffocating. The walls, once comforting, now felt like witnesses. The next morning, she walked into Nathaniel's office with her shoulders squared and her pulse pounding in her throat. He looked up, surprised to see her before the workday began. Claire. She closed the door behind her, locking it. Her voice shook, but her eyes did not. "How long have you been watching me?" He blinked. "Excuse me. Don't," she cut in. "Don't pretend you don't know." For a moment, he said nothing. Just studied her face, realizing too late what she must have found. His silence was an answer in itself. Her breath trembled. Why Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "For your safety." Safety. She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You violated my home and called it safety." He stood, his tone rising just slightly. "You live alone. Claire, you've been the target of media interest since you made me part of your world," she snapped. "You don't get to cage me and call it protection." Her voice wavered, but her words did not. "You don't protect people by imprisoning them." The room went still. Even the city noise outside seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, her eyes burning with betrayal, his filled with the kind of fear only control could hide. "Claire," he said finally, softer now, "you don't understand what people are capable of." "Maybe I don't," she replied, "but I know what you're capable of. And it's worse, Nathaniel, because you should have known better." She walked out before he could stop her, through the marble lobby, past the curious stares of his staff, into the open air. The city smelled like rain and gasoline sharp. Unwelcoming? Her chest felt hollow. Her vision blurred again, not from tears, but from the dizzying rush of anger and heartbreak. She kept walking, her heels clicking against the wet pavement, until the tower behind her disappeared into the mist. That night, she sat on the bathroom floor of her apartment, the cameras torn down and scattered in a pile beside her. Her body trembled with adrenaline, her mind refusing to quiet. And that's when it happened. The wave of nausea, the sudden heaviness in her chest, the undeniable instinct one she hadn't let herself imagine before. She reached for the small box she'd bought that morning, more out of dread than hope. Minutes later, she stared at the test in her shaking hands. Positive. Her breath broke. A sound half between a laugh and a sob escaped her lips. Life in the middle of chaos. A miracle, wrapped in heartbreak. She pressed a hand against her stomach, whispering through the silence, "It's okay. I've got you. We'll be okay." But even as she said it, her heart fractured because she knew that the man who had promised her protection had just destroyed her trust. Days passed before Nathaniel realized she wasn't coming back. Her desk remained untouched. Her favorite mug, the one with the tiny chip in the handle, still sat near the coffee machine. He called. She didn't answer. He sent people to check. She refused to see them. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Cross felt something he didn't know how to name. Not anger, not frustration, loss. He sat alone in his penthouse, the rain painting streaks down the glass. The cameras, all of them, had been shut down. But the silence that replaced them was worse. He thought about her words again and again. "You don't protect people by imprisoning them." And he realized she was right. He hadn't been protecting her. He had been protecting himself. From uncertainty, from vulnerability, from love. But the irony cut deep in trying to control everything. He'd lost the only thing that had ever made him want to let go. Outside, the rain eased. Inside, Nathaniel sat in the dim glow of his empty home, staring at the place where her laughter used to echo. He whispered into the quiet, "Claire." But the name dissolved into the stillness, unanswered. And somewhere across the city, Claire pressed her palm to her stomach again, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. Because sometimes the hardest storms aren't the ones that come from the sky, but the ones that rise from the cracks in your own heart. The rain eventually stopped, not all at once but slowly, like the sky itself was learning how to breathe again. Months had passed since that night Claire walked out of Cross Dynamics and out of Nathaniel's world. The city had changed seasons. Winter melted into spring, and then into the soft, forgiving light of early summer. But inside each of them, the storm lingered in different ways. For Claire, healing began in the smallest of steps. She rented a modest corner space in Pike Place, barely half the size of her old cafe. The sign above the door read, "Morning Tide," carved from the salvage wood of the first one. It wasn't perfect. The counters were scratched, the chairs mismatched, the espresso machine secondhand. But it was hers. Every morning, she'd unlock the door before sunrise, letting the scent of fresh ground coffee fill the air. Sometimes, customers recognized her from the old days and smiled with quiet sympathy. Sometimes, strangers wandered in, drawn by the warmth that seemed to linger in the place, the kind of warmth only hard-earned peace can bring. Claire smiled often, but it wasn't the same smile she once wore. It carried something gentler, wiser, a knowing of both loss and endurance. She never mentioned Nathaniel's name, not to Evelyn, not to anyone. And when letters began arriving all unsigned but unmistakably from him, she didn't open them. They stayed in a small drawer under the register, bound with a ribbon she never untied. She didn't hate him. She just couldn't let him back in. For Nathaniel, time moved differently. Days bled into nights, and nights into silence. He went to work, yes, but the precision that once defined him began to crack. Reports came in late. Meetings ended early. He avoided the office where she used to sit, unable to look at the empty desk. Daniel, his assistant, noticed first. He had always been quiet, loyal, and discreet, the kind of man who knew when to speak and when silence was the greater kindness. He watched as his boss, once untouchable, became a man haunted by his own reflection. "Sir," Daniel said one evening, standing in the doorway, "you haven't eaten today." Nathaniel looked up, eyes shadowed. "I'm not hungry." Daniel hesitated. "She's doing well." The cafe's open again. Nathaniel's pen froze midair. He didn't ask how Daniel knew. He didn't need to. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, the first in months. "She's working again?" he said softly. "Good." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The ache in his chest was familiar now, like an old injury that throbbed when the weather changed. Daniel placed a small envelope on his desk. "She sent this, well, not sent exactly. I found it in a bag of donations she gave to the foundation." Nathaniel hesitated before touching it. Inside was a receipt for a coffee donation to flood victims and a small note at the bottom in her handwriting. Sometimes rebuilding doesn't mean replacing what's lost. It means learning to live without the fear of losing again. He closed his eyes, the words settling into him like a slow exhale. But knowing she was safe didn't bring him peace. If anything, it deepened the emptiness. At night, sleep eluded him. He would lie awake in his penthouse, watching headlights move across the ceiling. Her voice echoed in his mind. "You don't protect people by imprisoning them." He'd spent his life building walls to keep the world out. Now, he was trapped inside them. Daniel finally convinced him to see a therapist. It took weeks of persuasion, quiet persistence, and a well-timed remark, "Sir, you built a company on fixing broken systems. Maybe it's time you learned how to fix a broken heart." Reluctantly, Nathaniel agreed. The therapist's office was nothing like his boardroom, small, cluttered, filled with sunlight and the faint scent of chamomile tea. For the first session, he said nothing. For the second, almost nothing. By the third, he spoke 2 sentences. "My wife died. I thought I was the one who was broken. But maybe I'm the one who broke everything else." Progress came slowly, painfully. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't managing his emotions, he was meeting them. And somewhere between those sessions, he began to see himself through Claire's eyes, not the CEO, not the man of control, but the frightened boy who never learned how to trust. Meanwhile, across the city, life quietly grew inside Claire. Her belly rounded gently, visible now beneath her apron. She worked slower these days, taking breaks when she needed to. Evelyn fussed over her constantly. "Are you sure you're okay working this much?" Claire smiled. "I'm not just working, I'm living. That's different." Sometimes, late at night after closing, she would sit in the same chair by the window and rest her hand over her stomach. The baby kicked strong, insistent, a reminder that life continued whether or not the heart was ready. She whispered to the little one, "We're going to be fine. We already are." Outside, the neon sign of morning tide glowed softly in the mist, a promise of light after the storm. Back in his office, Nathaniel looked out at that same skyline, though he didn't know she was only a few blocks away. The city stretched wide and indifferent, but beneath its hum, he felt something shift. He couldn't undo what he'd done. He couldn't ask her to forgive, but maybe he could learn how to deserve forgiveness someday. He turned off his phone, closed his laptop, and sat quietly in the dark. For once, he didn't reach for control. He let the silence stand, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like beginning. Time didn't rush anymore. It drifted slow and quiet, like a long exhale after too many storms. For both of them, silence had become a kind of companion, not comforting exactly, but familiar. The kind that sits beside you at night, reminding you of all the words you never said. Months had passed since the last letter Daniel delivered. Neither Nathaniel nor Claire had reached out again. It was as if their lives had split into two different melodies, separate, yet still faintly echoing each other. In the mornings, Claire opened Morning Tide to the soft hum of Seattle waking up. The small cafe glowed with gentle light, part home, part sanctuary. She moved slower now, her body rounded with new life, her hands resting often on her belly as she brewed the first pot of coffee. The regulars noticed, of course. Some offered congratulations, some just smiled knowingly, and Claire returned every gesture with quiet gratitude. She didn't speak of the baby's father. She didn't need to. This new chapter wasn't about loss or shame anymore. It was about choosing peace, even if it came wrapped in loneliness. Evelyn visited often, bringing groceries and motherly advice she pretended not to need. They would talk late into the evening about small things, recipes, memories, the strange comfort of routine. "Do you miss him?" Evelyn asked once, not unkindly. Claire hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "I miss the idea of who I thought he could be," she said softly. "Not the man he was." Evelyn nodded, her eyes gentle. "Sometimes that's the hardest part, to let go of the version we built in our hearts." Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what forgiveness really is, letting go of the version you wanted and learning to love what remains." Across the city, Nathaniel sat in his therapist's office, the morning sun spilling across the wooden floor. He'd been coming for months now, reluctantly at first, then with a quiet, steady discipline. Today, the therapist asked him something simple. "What does silence mean to you?" Nathaniel leaned back, considering. "For most of my life, silence meant control," he said. "It meant order, stability." The therapist nodded, and now he stared out the window for a long moment before answering. "Now it feels like absence, like standing in an empty room and realizing it's empty because you pushed everyone out." The words hung there, fragile and honest. He'd spent his whole life mastering control of his emotions, his surroundings, his success. But in the stillness of those sessions, he began to see the truth. Control wasn't strength, it was fear. Fear dressed in confidence. The fear of being seen, the fear of being vulnerable, the fear of not being enough. Sometimes, late at night, he would take out the letters he'd written but never sent. Stacks of them, each one dated, folded neatly, a record of the words he couldn't give voice to. "I think about you every morning. I wish I'd protected your trust instead of your safety. You were right about me." He would read them, then slide them back into the drawer, his silent confessions hidden under lock and key. It wasn't guilt that stopped him from sending them. It was respect. For the distance she'd chosen, for the life she was building without him. He told himself that loving her now meant staying away. Claire, too, had her quiet rituals. At night, she'd sit by the window of her small apartment above the cafe, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. She'd write letters, too, to her grandmother, to her unborn child, and sometimes, though she'd never admit it aloud, to Nathaniel. In them, she wrote not of anger, but of understanding. She wrote about the weather, the smell of coffee beans roasting, the sound of rain against the window. She wrote about how healing didn't come all at once, but in pieces in every cup she served, every laugh shared with a stranger, every moment she chose not to look back. But she never mailed those letters either. They stayed folded in her journal, tucked between recipes and half-finished thoughts. Two people, two sets of letters, both unsent, both still somehow reaching for each other across the quiet. One afternoon, while closing the cafe, Claire felt an unfamiliar pull in her belly, not pain, just movement. She froze, one hand resting on her stomach. Then it happened again, faint, fluttering, alive. Her breath caught, and for the first time, she laughed a sound full of wonder and disbelief. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're really in there, aren't you?" The baby kicked again, gentle but sure. It felt like an answer, a heartbeat inside a heartbeat. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness this time, but of awe. Life was still moving forward quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it fully. The miracle, the forgiveness, the fragile beginning of something new. Across the city, Nathaniel sat alone in his office, the same hour, staring at the skyline. He didn't know why, but a strange calm washed over him as if someone had just taken a deep breath. And he could feel it too. He looked down at the final letter he'd written that night and smiled faintly. For once. He didn't tear it up. He just whispered to the empty room, "Be happy, Claire." The city hummed softly beneath the weight of twilight, 1,000 lives unfolding in quiet harmony. And in that silence, in the space between what was lost and what was beginning, two hearts distant but still connected finally found peace in the sound of nothing at all. The days grew longer as summer deepened, and for a while, life found its rhythm again. Claire moved with the calm certainty of a woman preparing for something both terrifying and beautiful. The cafe had become her sanctuary. The hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, the scent of freshly baked bread. Each morning began with sunlight spilling through the window, and each evening ended with her hand resting over the small swell of her stomach, feeling the quiet rhythm of new life inside her. There was peace in that routine, predictable, grounded, until the morning it wasn't. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that seemed perfectly ordinary. The rain had come and gone before dawn, leaving the city washed and gleaming. Claire opened Morning Tide as usual, humming softly as she arranged pastries in the glass case. She moved slower these days, careful and deliberate. Evelyn had called in sick, so it was just Claire behind the counter. The regulars came and went, each greeting her with warmth and familiarity. She felt tired, yes, but it was a familiar tired, the kind she'd learned to live with. Around noon, the cafe quieted. She wiped down the counter, leaned against it for a moment, and smiled at the small flutter beneath her ribs. Then, suddenly a sharp pain. It started low, then spread like fire through her body. Her vision blurred. The air seemed to thin around her. She tried to steady herself, to breathe, to stay upright. But the world tilted. The last thing she saw was the sunlight glinting off the glass door, and then darkness. When she came to, the first thing she heard was the steady beep of a heart monitor. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled her nose. White walls, machines, voices murmuring. A nurse leaned over her. "Ms. Whitmore, can you hear me?" Claire nodded weakly. Her throat was dry. Her lips cracked. "What happened?" "You collapsed at your cafe," the nurse said gently. "Someone found you and called an ambulance. You're at Seattle General." Claire's eyes darted downward toward her belly. "The baby," she whispered. The nurse smiled softly. "Still holding strong? But you need rest and monitoring. You've been under a lot of stress." Claire exhaled, tears slipping down her temples. She hadn't realized how afraid she'd been until that moment. Across the city, Nathaniel was in the middle of a board meeting when Daniel entered the room, his expression pale. "Sir," he said quietly, leaning close. "It's Claire." The sound of her name hit him like a blow. He didn't ask how Daniel knew didn't care. He just stood up. "Where is she, Seattle General?" Nathaniel didn't wait another second. He left the meeting mid-sentence, his executives staring in stunned silence as he strode out the door. By the time he reached the lobby, the rain had returned hard, relentless, almost punishing. He didn't bother with an umbrella. He drove too fast, his mind a blur of memory and regret. Every red light felt unbearable, every second stretched thin with fear. He told himself it was worry logical, human concern. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't control anymore. It was terror, the kind that only love could cause. When he arrived at the hospital, his clothes were soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. He pushed through the front desk, breathless. "Claire Whitmore," he said, his voice cracking despite himself. The nurse looked up, startled by the intensity in his tone. "Room 412, she replied. "But sir, you'll need—" He was already gone. Outside her room, he hesitated for the first time in years. For a man who'd built empires on decisiveness, he suddenly didn't know what to do with his hands, his breath, or his heart. Through the small glass pane, he saw her pale but breathing, a faint trace of color returning to her cheeks. The sight undid him. He entered quietly. The monitor beeped steadily, each sound a fragile reassurance that both she and the child were still here. Claire stirred at the sound of his footsteps. When her eyes opened, they widened in disbelief. "Nathaniel?" He swallowed hard. "You scared me." Her lips trembled. "How did you, Daniel?" he said simply. "He called me." There was silence then, the kind that said everything words could not. The air between them thickened with everything unfinished. Finally, she spoke, her voice fragile. "You shouldn't be here." He nodded slowly. "You're right, but I couldn't stay away." For a moment, he looked at her not as the woman who had once signed a contract, but as the woman who had unknowingly changed his entire world. "I was wrong," he said quietly, "about everything, about what control meant, about what love was." Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak. He stepped closer, then stopped, afraid even his presence might hurt her. A doctor entered then, a woman with kind eyes and a steady voice. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, glancing between them, "you and the baby are stable, but the pregnancy is high risk. You'll need rest, reduced stress, and regular monitoring." Claire nodded, tears pooling again. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his protective instinct rising. "Tell me what she needs," he said firmly. "I'll make sure she has it." The doctor gave him a measured look. "She needs peace, Mr. Cross, not pressure." The words landed harder than she could have known. Nathaniel lowered his gaze. "Then I'll give her that." When the doctor left, silence filled the room again. Nathaniel stood by the window, rain streaking down the glass. Claire watched him, the man who once tried to control every variable in life, now standing still, utterly helpless before love. He turned back to her, his voice breaking just slightly. "I can't lose you, either of you." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she believed he meant it. Outside, the rain slowed. Inside, the machines hummed softly, steady as two hearts finding their rhythm again. And somewhere between fear and forgiveness, something inside both of them shifted a quiet surrender to the truth they could no longer deny, that love, when real, isn't control, it's courage. The hospital never truly slept. It hummed through the night machines, beeping softly, footsteps echoing down sterile halls, whispers carried on the scent of disinfectant and rain. Claire drifted in and out of sleep, her body weak but steady. Every so often, she'd wake to find Nathaniel still there, sitting quietly in the chair beside her bed, his tie undone, his hair damp, eyes hollowed by worry and something deeper. He hadn't left since the moment he arrived. Outside the window, the storm had passed, leaving a faint silver glow across the city. Inside, another kind of storm lingered, silent, human, full of truths waiting to surface. It was close to midnight when Claire stirred again. Nathaniel rose immediately, reaching for the glass of water on the table. "You should rest," he said gently. She managed a faint smile. "So should you." He hesitated, then sat back down. For a long time, they didn't speak. The quiet between them wasn't hostile anymore. It was fragile, like two people standing at the edge of something neither could name. Finally, Claire broke the silence. You said earlier, you were wrong about what love was. Nathaniel looked down at his hands. I was... She waited, giving him the space he'd never given anyone else. When he spoke again, his voice was low, rough, almost unrecognizable. I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always closed. He leaned back, staring somewhere past her, into memory. When I was 10, he began. Someone tried to kidnap me outside my school. The words hung there, heavy, unexpected. Claire's breath caught. Nathaniel. He shook his head slightly, continuing. They didn't get far. The driver saw them, called for help. The police found me an hour later, sitting in the back of a van, tied up, terrified. He paused. You'd think my father would have been relieved, but he wasn't. He was furious. Claire frowned softly. Furious. Why, Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Because he said fear made me weak. He told me I'd embarrassed him, that a cross should never lose control, not even to fear. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking for the first time. I learned that night that safety wasn't something you were given. You had to build it, brick by brick, wall by wall, until nothing and no one could ever touch you again. Claire's eyes filled with quiet sadness. He looked up then, meeting her gaze, the man who'd once been carved from steel, now trembling beneath the weight of his own honesty. I learned to build walls, not bridges, he said simply. The truth in his voice was raw, not dramatic, not rehearsed, just real. The kind of truth that only comes when there's nothing left to hide. For a while, neither spoke. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the space between them. Then, softly, Claire reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and placed it over his. The gesture was small, but to Nathaniel, it felt like the world had shifted. I don't hate you, she whispered. I did, for a while, but not anymore. He blinked, stunned by her gentleness. After everything I did, how can you? Because I've made my own mistakes too, she said. Her eyes softened, full of something he didn't deserve but desperately needed compassion. I forgive you, Nathaniel, but I won't forget. Her voice steadied, firm. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just means I'm not going to carry your sins in my heart anymore. He nodded slowly, his throat tight. That's more grace than I deserve. Maybe, she said quietly. But we don't give grace because someone earns it. We give it because we're tired of living without peace. The night deepened around them. Outside, the rain returned, not angry this time, just soft, rhythmic, cleansing. Nathaniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, running a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You know, he said after a long pause, I used to think love was control, that if you could plan it, protect it, define it, it couldn't hurt you. He exhaled. But I see now that was just fear, pretending to be confidence. Claire smiled faintly. Fear wears a lot of clever disguises. He looked at her, then really looked. For the first time, he didn't see her as someone he'd saved, or hurt, or needed to control. He saw her as she truly was, her own person, strong, compassionate, whole, and maybe, he thought, that was the beginning of something real, not romance. Not redemption, but understanding. The clock ticked past 2 a. The nurse peeked in once, smiled quietly at the sight of them. Two people who had stopped pretending, finally facing the wreckage and the beauty of what they'd built. Claire shifted slightly, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach. Nathaniel followed the gesture, his expression softening with awe. Do you think, he began, hesitating. Do you think I could ever be the kind of man worthy of being in that child's life? Claire looked at him for a long time. Her voice was calm, steady. I think that's a choice you have to make every day. Not for me, not for the baby, for yourself. He nodded, her words sinking in like a quiet vow. as dawn crept through the hospital window, painting the room in muted gold. Nathaniel finally leaned back in his chair, for the first time in years. His chest felt lighter, not because he'd fixed something, but because he'd finally stopped running from it. Claire watched him, her expression unreadable but kind, and in that shared silence, something fragile but true began to take shape. Not reconciliation, not yet, but understanding. The kind that doesn't erase pain, but transforms it into something that might, someday, resemble peace. Morning came softly to the hospital room. The light through the blinds was pale and kind, the kind of light that asks for silence, not attention. Claire was sleeping, her breathing steady, her hand resting over her belly as if protecting something sacred. Nathaniel sat in the same chair he'd occupied through the night, eyes heavy but heart lighter than it had been in years. He hadn't asked for forgiveness again. He didn't need to. What had passed between them in those quiet hours is confession. Her grace had been enough for now. When the nurse finally came in and gently urged him to go home, Nathaniel nodded, but as he left the room, he turned back once more. He didn't speak. He simply looked as if memorizing the stillness, the proof that she was safe. For a man who had spent his life trying to control everything, walking away and letting the world move without him felt like the hardest and most human thing he'd ever done. The following weeks unfolded slowly. Claire's recovery was steady but fragile. She moved into a quieter routine, fewer hours at the cafe, more hours of rest, more cups of tea than coffee. Her body healed, and so did her heart, though both in their own unpredictable ways. Nathaniel visited sometimes not every day, not even every week, but often enough that she noticed. He never came empty-handed, yet never overstayed. Sometimes he brought flowers, not extravagant bouquets, but single stems, wild and imperfect, the kind you'd find growing by the roadside. Sometimes it was soup still warm, carried clumsily in his hands as though he'd made it himself. And sometimes he brought nothing but silence. They'd sit together by her window, her hands resting on her stomach, his folded in his lap, two people who had finally learned that not every moment needed to be filled with words. It was during one of those visits that Claire realized something had changed in him. He no longer tried to fix everything. He no longer filled the silence with plans or promises. He just showed up consistent, humble, quiet. There was a softness now in his presence, a kind of reverence that hadn't been there before, as if he understood that her trust was not something he could earn back in grand gestures, but in patience. When he left, he never said goodbye only, "Take care of yourself," and she would nod, watching as he disappeared down the hallway. Always walking, never rushing, they began writing letters again, not the desperate if it unfinished kind from before, but real ones exchanged intentionally, handwritten and folded neatly, like small acts of faith. His letters were honest, unpolished, sometimes awkward. He wrote about therapy, about learning to listen, about the strange peace he found in not being the man everyone feared anymore. He wrote about guilt not as a burden, but as a teacher. And Claire, in turn, wrote back. She told him about the baby's growth, the new recipes she was trying, the quiet joy she felt watching the sunrise from the cafe window. She didn't write about love, not directly, but every word carried warmth, the kind that builds trust, one line at a time. In one letter, Nathaniel wrote, "I used to believe control kept me safe, but I see now, control only kept me alone. I'm trying to learn the difference." Claire read that line over and over, tears blurring the ink. Then she replied, "Safety isn't in control, Nathaniel. It's in connection, the kind that doesn't demand, it just exists." When he received her response, he sat in his office for a long time, the paper trembling in his hands. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, not out of regret, but out of relief. Their letters became a rhythm of sorts, a dialogue without pressure, a bridge that neither rushed to cross. Sometimes, she'd open the mailbox and find a simple note. "The hydrangeas outside your cafe are blooming again. Thought you'd like to know." Other times, he'd receive a card written in her looping hand. The baby kicked again today. Stronger this time. I think she's a fighter. He'd smile quietly, reading those words in the solitude of his apartment, imagining the life she was building, a life that no longer needed him, yet somehow still had space for his presence. One evening, near the end of her recovery, Claire stood in the cafe after closing. The lights were dim, the air warm with the scent of coffee and vanilla. She leaned against the counter, reading one of his newer letters, her fingers tracing the lines as if feeling for truth between the words. It wasn't love yet, but it was something honest, something that didn't need to prove itself. Evelyn entered quietly, hanging her coat. Another letter, she asked, smiling knowingly. Claire nodded. Evelyn poured herself a cup of coffee, leaned on the counter, and said softly, "Do you trust him again?" Claire thought for a long moment. Finally, she answered, "I'm learning to." And for the first time in a long time, those words didn't feel heavy. They felt like freedom. That night, after locking up, Claire walked home beneath a soft drizzle. The streets shimmered under the glow of streetlights, the world smelling faintly of rain and possibility. When she reached her apartment, she opened her journal and began to write not a reply this time, but something for herself. Healing isn't a destination, she wrote. It's distance, the space you give yourself to breathe again, and the grace you offer someone who's learning how to do the same. She closed the journal, placed it beside her grandmother's coffee book, and turned off the lamp. Outside, the city sighed gentle, alive. And in that quiet moment, as the rain tapped softly on the window, both she and Nathaniel, miles apart, felt something they hadn't in years. Peace. Not perfect, but real. Autumn arrived softly that year. The air turned crisp. The trees lining Seattle's streets blazed in shades of amber and gold. Change had settled into both of their lives, gentle, almost invisible, but real. Claire's belly had grown round and full, her movement slower but sure. She had learned to live without the ache of waiting, and Nathaniel had learned to live without the illusion of control. In the distance between them, both had found something that looked very much like peace. It began with an announcement that surprised the city and everyone who knew his name. Cross Dynamics, long known for its steel-cold efficiency and profit-driven empire, was launching a new initiative. The Cross Foundation, a non-profit division dedicated to rebuilding lives affected by natural disasters and supporting single mothers who had lost their livelihoods. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't strategy. It was something else, something quieter, more human. At the press conference, Nathaniel stood behind the podium, wearing a simple gray suit. Gone was the man who measured his worth by dominance and success. His tone was softer now, his words slower, deliberate. He spoke not as a CEO, but as a man who had finally seen the cost of indifference. When we lose everything, he said, we often discover what truly matters. Not the walls we build, but the hands we hold. Not the control we cling to, but the grace we're given. Reporters scribbled their notes, cameras flashed, but Nathaniel's gaze drifted past the lights towards something unseen. Maybe memory, maybe Claire. Weeks later, the foundation opened its first outreach center near the waterfront, the same area that had been devastated by floods 2 years earlier. It was a bright, airy space filled with the scent of fresh paint and the hum of possibility. Volunteers sorted boxes of clothing. Children played in the corner, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic clatter of rebuilding. And there, among them, was Nathaniel. Not in a suit, not giving orders, but wearing rolled-up sleeves and paint-stained gloves. He moved quietly through the room, helping lift tables, carrying boxes, listening to stories that once might have made him uncomfortable. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to solve or fix, he was simply present. Claire hadn't planned to go. She told herself it didn't matter what he was doing, that her life had moved on. But when Evelyn showed her the article Cross Foundation opens to aid local families, she felt something stir. Curiosity, not about him, but about the truth of who he'd become. A week later, she found herself standing outside the foundation's new building, a paper cup of coffee warming her hands. She wore a scarf and a soft wool coat, her hair tucked under a hat. No one recognized her as she stepped through the doors. The air inside buzzed with quiet energy, laughter, conversation, purpose. She wandered among the volunteers, admiring the photographs on the wall, images of families rebuilding, mothers holding their children, workers repairing flooded homes. And then she saw him, Nathaniel. He was crouched beside a young woman, her toddler perched on her knee. The woman's eyes were tired but grateful as she spoke, and Nathaniel listened, really listened, his attention steady, his expression open. When the little boy reached out, Nathaniel smiled, offering his hand for a high five. It was such a small, ordinary gesture, and yet, for Claire, it felt extraordinary, because this was not the man who once hid behind glass walls and boardroom tables. This was a man who had finally stepped into the world unguarded, human. She didn't approach him. She didn't need to. Watching was enough. In his quiet acts, she saw what words could never have explained, that pain had taught him empathy, and her absence had taught him humility. Claire turned to leave, pausing near the door. Through the reflection in the glass, she caught one last glimpse of him, his hands moving as he gestured, his posture softer now, almost gentle. A small smile touched her lips. He didn't know she was there, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes, closure doesn't come in conversations. It comes in witnessing change and knowing you were part of the reason it happened. That evening, back at the cafe, Claire set a small bouquet of hydrangeas in a vase near the counter. The flowers were the same kind Nathaniel had once sent during her recovery. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and opened her journal. She wrote, "Some people say the past can't change, but maybe what they mean is the people can, not through promises or apologies, but through action, through how they choose to love the world after it's broken them." She closed the journal, resting her hand over her belly. The baby kicked lightly, a gentle reminder of life's persistence. Claire smiled. Maybe this was what forgiveness looked like when it finally stopped hurting. Not a reunion, but a release. Across the city, as the foundation lights dimmed for the night, Nathaniel stood by the window of his office, watching the reflection of volunteers cleaning up. Daniel entered quietly. "Successful first week," he said. Nathaniel nodded. "Yes, but success doesn't feel like it used to." Daniel tilted his head. "How does it feel now?" Nathaniel looked out at the city, his voice low, like purpose. And maybe, just maybe, that was the truest success of all. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Nathaniel found one of Claire's old letters tucked inside a book he'd been reading. The edges were worn, the ink faint. He read it again, her handwriting looping softly across the page. "You can't rebuild what's been lost by holding on to what broke you. Sometimes, you have to start over with open hands." He smiled faintly, closing his eyes. She had been right about everything, and though she wasn't beside him, her presence lingered in every decision he made, in every life the foundation touched. He wasn't the same man anymore. And maybe that was the miracle neither of them had expected, that love could transform, even when it didn't return the same way it was given. Winter came quietly that year, soft, gray, and kind. The city slowed down beneath the weight of fog and memory, and somewhere between the quiet mornings and the first flakes of snow, two lives that had once run parallel began to turn toward each other again. For months, they hadn't spoken, no letters, no phone calls, only the silent acknowledgement that they existed in the same world, he, rebuilding others, and she, rebuilding herself. But healing has a strange way of circling back. When two hearts learn peace apart, sometimes fate gives them one more chance to meet, not to fix what was broken, but to see how far they've both come. It was Evelyn who arranged it, though she'd never admit it outright. She stopped by Morning Tide one afternoon, holding a small cream envelope. "An invitation," she said, eyes glinting. "Dinner, a fundraising event for the Cross Foundation. You should go." Claire hesitated, drying her hands on a towel. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Evelyn tilted her head. It's not about him. It's about you, about seeing what you helped build. And that night, after the cafe lights dimmed and the city hummed outside, Claire turned the envelope over in her hands. Inside was a simple card, Cross Foundation Annual Benefit Dinner, December 14th, 7 p.m. At the bottom, a handwritten note. You once told me some things are worth rebuilding. I hope this is one of them. N.C. She stared at the words for a long moment. Not command, not apology, just an invitation. The evening of the dinner. Seattle shimmered under soft snow and golden lights. Claire stood before the mirror, adjusting the navy blue dress Evelyn had insisted she wear. Her hair was loose, her face calm, not nervous, not expectant, just ready. When she walked into the ballroom, it was warm and bright, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of music. People greeted her politely, not recognizing her as the quiet force behind the story that had changed the man at the center of it all. And then she saw him. Nathaniel stood across the room, speaking to a group of donors. His suit was simple, his demeanor composed, but there was something gentler in his posture now, something open in the way he smiled. When their eyes met, he stopped mid-sentence. A flicker of something surprise, gratitude, awe crossed his face. He excused himself quietly and walked toward her. Claire. Her name left his lips like a prayer. She smiled faintly. It's been a while. He nodded. It has. Then, after a pause, you look happy. I am, she said simply. And you. He glanced around at the crowd, at the people laughing, eating, talking. I'm learning, he said, still learning. There was no tension in his voice this time, no control, no edge, just honesty. And that honesty disarmed her more than any apology could have. Later, they slipped out onto the terrace, the kind of quiet space where conversation finds its own rhythm. Snow drifted softly through the light. The city below glowed in muted silver and gold. They stood side by side, hands resting on the cold railing. The air between them charged not with regret, but with something gentler, the peace that comes after acceptance. Nathaniel broke the silence first. I don't expect anything, he said quietly. Not forgiveness, not another chance. I just wanted to thank you. For what she asked, for saving me, he said. Then, realizing how it sounded, he added softly, no, not saving, teaching. She turned toward him, her expression thoughtful. You did the work. Nathaniel, you changed because you wanted to. He shook his head slightly. No, I changed because losing you showed me who I really was, and who I didn't want to be anymore. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Claire smiled, then small, sincere. Maybe we both needed to lose everything, she said quietly, to see what truly mattered. He looked at her, eyes steady. And what matters now? She thought about it, the cafe, the laughter of customers, the soft flutter of tiny feet inside her apartment, the peace she felt waking up each morning to a world she no longer feared. Kindness, she said finally. Grace, the simple things, the kind that last. Nathaniel nodded slowly. I used to think power mattered, he admitted. Now, I think peace does. He reached into his coat pocket, hesitating before handing her a small folded envelope. Inside was a photograph, a candid shot from the foundation's opening day. Claire recognized herself instantly, standing in the background with her scarf, watching him from afar. You saw me that day, she asked softly. He smiled. I did. But I also knew you didn't want to be seen. Claire laughed under her breath. You were right. I usually am. He teased gently, and for the first time, she didn't hear arrogance in his tone, just playfulness, the kind of easy warmth that comes only after every wall has finally fallen. They stayed outside for a while, talking not about the past, but about everything else. Books, coffee, the baby's favorite lullaby. When the snow began to fall harder, Nathaniel offered his coat, and this time she accepted. Before they went back inside, he turned to her one last time. "Whatever the future looks like," he said, "I just want you to know I'll be grateful for you every day of it." She smiled, eyes glistening with quiet emotion. "And I'll be grateful for who you've become." They didn't make promises. They didn't define what came next. Some stories, after all, don't need perfect endings. They just need moments honest. Human moments to remind us that even broken paths can still lead to peace. Inside, the music swelled softly. Claire and Nathaniel walked back into the light, not hand in hand, but side by side, two people who had lost everything once and found something better: clarity, compassion, and the courage to begin again. Winter melted slowly into spring, and with it came the quiet anticipation of new beginnings. Claire's cafe bloomed with fresh flowers and laughter again. The smell of cinnamon and roasted coffee filled the air, and every morning she would touch her belly, feeling the slow, rhythmic flutter of life within her, a heartbeat that reminded her the past was not the end of her story. Nathaniel visited occasionally now, not out of obligation, but from something simpler, truer. He would stop by in the afternoons, bringing small gifts for the baby: a stuffed bear, a blanket embroidered with tiny stars, a book of lullabies he pretended he didn't read himself at night. Their conversations had softened. No contracts, no expectations. Just two people learning how to exist together in peace. And when Claire laughed that warm, unguarded laugh that had once terrified him with its sincerity, Nathaniel felt something inside him heal a little more. The night of the birth came quietly, like most miracles do, unannounced, yet impossible to mistake once they arrive. It was late past midnight. Rain whispered against the windows, and Claire sat in her apartment, half reading a book, when the first sharp pain rippled through her. She froze, hands instinctively reaching for the edge of the table. Another wave, stronger this time. She exhaled, steadying herself. The hospital bag was already packed by the door. Evelyn's doing, of course. She called her, but the call went unanswered. Too late. Perhaps. Then, with trembling hands, she did something she hadn't done in months. She called Nathaniel. He answered on the first ring. Claire. His voice was rough, sleepy, worried. "I think it's time," she whispered, breath uneven. There was a pause and then the sound of movement. Keys. Rain. "I'm coming," he said, and before she could say anything else, the line went dead. The drive to the hospital was a blur of rain and panic. Nathaniel's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every second a reminder of all the moments he'd failed to show up before. But this time, he would. He had to. When he reached the hospital, he barely remembered parking. He ran through the sliding doors, chest heaving, searching for her name at the front desk. "She's in labor," the nurse said, leading him down the corridor. He stopped only when he saw her sitting on the bed, pale, sweat on her brow, her hair falling loose around her face. She looked up, and despite the pain, her eyes softened when they met his. "You made it," she whispered. He swallowed hard. "I told you I would." Hours passed in waves of pain, of waiting, of hope. Nathaniel stayed by her side, holding her hand through every contraction, his thumb brushing against her knuckles in silent reassurance. There were moments when she wanted to scream, to curse, to cry, but every time she looked at him, she saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes. Fear, yes, but also love. The kind of love that doesn't demand or define it, simply stays. "Breathe." "Claire," he whispered, his own voice shaking. "You're doing so well." And she did. Because this time, she wasn't alone. 1 year later, the rain returned to Seattle soft, steady, and almost musical as it danced against the glass of Morning Tide Cafe. But this time, it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like home, inside, The cafe was alive again, laughter, the hiss of steaming milk, the gentle clink of cups against saucers. The scent of cinnamon and roasted coffee filled the air, mingling with the sweetness of fresh flowers that lined the walls. Claire moved gracefully behind the counter, her hands steady, her smile unhurried. The rhythm of her world had found its way back. Outside, the sign above the door gleamed under the light drizzle Morning Tide Cafe, in partnership with the Cross Foundation. A small plaque beneath it read, "Rebuilt on hope, served with love." It had been a long year, one of late nights, early mornings, and learning how to hold joy without waiting for the storm. After the twins were born, a boy and a girl, perfect and loud and full of life, Nathaniel and Claire had spent months learning what it meant to be a family. Not out of duty, not out of contract, but out of choice. He had cried when he held them for the first time. Not the quiet kind of tears he'd hidden his whole life, but the kind that comes when a man realizes he has finally been forgiven by something greater than words, by life itself. The past had lost its hold on him that day. Now, a year later, he sat at one of the corner tables, watching Claire move through the cafe with ease, her hair tied loosely, her laughter carrying across the room like sunlight through rain. The twins, now toddling, sat near the window, babbling to anyone who would listen. He couldn't stop smiling. Sometimes, redemption doesn't announce itself. It just sits quietly in the corner, watching the people you love find their joy again. That afternoon, as the clouds began to thin, the cafe's back garden filled with friends, family, and soft music. Rows of white chairs stood beneath twinkling lights strung between trees. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses and rain. It wasn't a grand wedding, no ballroom, no extravagance, just a celebration of two people who had already been through every storm life could offer. Evelyn stood proudly near the front, holding one of the twins. Daniel adjusted Nathaniel's tie for what felt like the 10th time. And Claire, standing beneath the archway of ivy and flowers, smiled in that calm, radiant way that made even the clouds seem to pause. When Nathaniel walked toward her, there was no nervousness, only certainty. He had spent years controlling everything, but this moment was the first thing he ever surrendered to, completely. He took her hands in his voice steady, low, filled with emotion that didn't need to be restrained anymore. "Claire," he began softly, "when I met you, I thought I was a man who had everything, but I didn't know what everything meant until the day I lost you. You taught me that love isn't control, it's courage. It's choosing to show up every day even when you're afraid." She smiled, eyes glistening. "And you taught me that sometimes. The ones who seem hardest to love are the ones who need it most." He chuckled under his breath, the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who finally understands the weight and lightness of grace. The officiant spoke quietly, and as the rain began to fall again, soft, almost reverent, they exchanged vows, simple and true. When he kissed her, the room broke into applause and laughter, and somewhere in the back, Evelyn whispered, "Finally." The celebration spilled into the evening. Music drifted through the garden. Children ran barefoot on the wet grass, chasing bubbles that glimmered under the lights. Nathaniel lifted one of the twins onto his shoulder, and for a moment, he stood still watching the crowd, the glow, the life that had grown from so much loss. He found Claire's gaze across the garden. She was holding their daughter, her face illuminated by the soft gold of lantern light. And in that instant, he understood what full circle really meant. It wasn't about ending where you started. It was about finding your way home after losing sight of it. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the twins had finally fallen asleep, they sat together inside the cafe, just the two of them, surrounded by the quiet hum of the espresso machines and the rhythmic patter of rain. The lights were dim, the air smelled of coffee and rain-soaked earth. Claire leaned her head against Nathaniel's shoulder. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "Do you ever think about how it all began? The flood, the contract, everything." He nodded slowly. "Every day." She smiled faintly. Strange, isn't it, that all that pain led us here? He turned toward her, his voice low and tender. Sometimes, the things that break us are the same ones that set us free. She looked up, their eyes meeting in the quiet. Outside, the rain softened to a gentle drizzle. Inside, the cafe glowed with warmth, laughter lingering in the walls, love woven into every sound, every breath, every heartbeat. As the night deepened, the lights flickered low, the rain kept its slow rhythm against the windows, a lullaby for a world finally at peace. And in that small cafe, where once everything had been lost, a new life, a new story had begun. Because sometimes, coming full circle isn't about returning to the past. It's about honoring it, forgiving it, and choosing again and again to love, despite it. Rain outside, laughter inside, and the soft whisper of a world that had learned how to begin again. In the end, The Millionaire CEO and his secretary isn't just a love story. It's a mirror reflecting the quiet truth that every heart, no matter how guarded, is longing to be understood. Life often breaks us in unexpected ways. Storms come, dreams fall apart, and sometimes survival forces us to make choices we never thought we would. But through every loss, there's a chance, a sacred space to rebuild differently. This story reminds us that control is an illusion, but compassion is real. That forgiveness, both of ourselves and others, is the bridge between pain and peace. And that love, when it's stripped of pride and fear, becomes the most powerful form of healing. We all carry contracts written by life promises, regrets, second chances. But maybe, as Claire and Nathaniel discovered, not all contracts are written on paper. Some are written in courage, in kindness, and in the quiet choice to keep our hearts open, no matter how many times the world has asked us to close them. Because sometimes, the greatest wealth we can ever hold is simply the ability to love again. Thank you, dear friends, for spending this time with us, for listening, feeling, and walking through this story of love, loss, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing more heartfelt stories, stories that remind us all that hope is never too late, and love can still find its way, even after the storm. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and never stop believing in the quiet miracles of everyday life.